Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now it's just about that time of year again. Ever since I bought myself a GTX 750 Ti a few years ago, it fast became one of my favourite graphics cards, but I'm sure you long-time viewers are just about sick of hearing about it. I once said though, upon upgrading, that I would revisit it again every year to check out its performance and see how well it holds up when it comes to running the latest and demanding titles. Today, we're doing just that once again to see if this card still represents a decent budget choice. I mentioned it in my great used GPUs list a few videos ago, so now I'll be putting my money where my mouth is and seeing just what it can do in 2018, running the latest drivers and playing some of the latest games. Today we've got the EVGA Superclocked edition to look at, and one that still requires no PCIe connectors, a huge part of why these are still so appealing, especially for those on a budget or for people with weaker power supplies. But enough chit chat, let's get into the games. The first title in this video is actually the newest and probably the most demanding. Some would use the word unoptimized, but Assassin's Creed Odyssey is definitely a fun one nonetheless. With the 750 Ti I had to turn things down to medium and adjust the resolution ever so slightly to run the game at 900p. Now this didn't differ too much from 1080p, but it will guarantee a closer to 30 frames per second experience. In fact, 30 frames per second was the average, and I'd recommend capping the frame rate to 30, otherwise it does get a little bit jumpy. Now I chose this area of the game, an area that you'll discover sort of in the second chapter of the story without giving too much away, but it seems to be more demanding than other areas that I've explored on the map. It's certainly more demanding than the first island of Catalonia that you start the game on, so I decided to benchmark it around about here. The average of 30 is a combined average, which is taken from sort of doing lots of different things, exploring the open sea, running around a few of the in-game islands. I mean, this map is absolutely massive, so there's tons to do, and your frame rate will differ accordingly. But here, overall, Assassin's Creed after about 2 hours of gameplay, and we saw 30 FPS on average. Now when it came to Call of Duty World War II, the 750 Ti managed to play the game just fine at 1080p. In fact, I let the game choose its own settings. At first it adjusted the resolution to 720p, and I thought that was a little bit low and that we could do a lot better than that. It turns out we could, because at 1080p, with a mixture of medium and high settings, we averaged 70 frames per second during the opening couple of levels. It might be worth capping the frame rate to 60 FPS just to avoid any sort of sudden spikes in frames, but overall it was a very nice experience indeed. Call of Duty World War II is rather varied when it comes to not only performance but how it looks, depending on what you do with the settings, so it's pretty much ready to run on even those weaker entry-level cards too. Although it isn't without its performance issues, and some hardware I have had some problems with, but here, the 750 Ti 2GB runs it absolutely flawlessly. Just don't go turning everything up to Ultra, and that applies throughout really. Next up it's Fortnite, and once again it ran perfectly. Highest settings 1080p, the game actually auto adjusted to epic settings with a 720p render scaling, but I cranked that back up to 1080p, lowered the settings overall to high, turned off motion blur, and of course kept VSync off as well, which in turn gave us a very smooth 70 frames per second all round about. Fortnite's one of those games that I started off really not liking, and after a couple of months of playing it, I still don't really like it. No, but in all honesty, it's definitely a fun one to play, and a game that will run quite well on some budget cards. You know, some people ask me why is it so demanding, or why does it run so badly on their system, and all I can say is that it runs on the Unreal Engine, which has been known to cause a few performance issues with some systems. Of course, it's quite a demanding engine, and although the game doesn't look like much, it can present a few issues on some occasions. Here though, once again, it was a perfect experience from the 750 Ti. The next game actually surprised me quite a bit. Forza Horizon 4 here with the 750 Ti, and we were able to hit 45 frames per second at 1080p with the medium preset. Now upon launching, the game will detect your system and set things accordingly. It will pretty much tell you what preset it's going to use, and I just went with the flow here. I let it choose medium, jumped into the game, although you will still get a few low video memory warnings. I thought this only happened on 1GB cards, but it turns out that it happens on 2GB cards as well. You can just ignore that though, and I think there might even be a way to turn that off, because there really wasn't any issues running this game with this GPU. I mean, the map's quite big, quite varied, but all in all, you'll have a pretty decent time playing Forza with a graphics card like this one. Next up, it's PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and we weren't quite able to achieve 60 frames per second here on average. We did get around 50 to 55 most of the time at 1080p, but we did have to turn things down to low as well. I think very low settings may have done the trick, but I decided to keep things at low because, for me, it still ran very well, and I think for the difference in graphics between low and very low, you're better off just keeping it at a slightly higher preset and getting around 50 to 55 frames per second instead. That's my opinion anyway, but of course if you want that solid 60, if you're determined to get that 60 FPS, then very low would be best for you and best for this card. A lower resolution will also do the trick, but at 1080p you should have no problems. There was no heavy stuttering, anything like that. Actually, saying that, there were one or two instances where the frame rate dropped completely, but all in all, it was pretty decent overall. Next up, we have another open world racing game in the form of The Crew 2. Now this one takes place in a completely open world USA. It's a very fun game to play, and the 750 Ti seemed to handle it quite well. 1080p medium settings once again, and we averaged 40 frames per second. This is probably the second most demanding game then that we've tested today, aside from Assassin's Creed Odyssey of course, but it was a pretty decent experience. You can switch between vehicles quite quickly, like a car or motorbike, aeroplane and boat, and on a few occasions when I did that, I did experience some frame drops, but it was nothing too bad, nothing too major. There is just a general game glitch where the aeroplane that you switch to will just stop in midair and fall out of the sky, but you can't do anything about that. As I say, that's just a game problem, an engine problem, as opposed to a GPU problem. Let's move on to the last title today, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. This is actually a very well optimised game from my experience, and we were able to run this one with the high settings at 1080p, and we saw a pretty fantastic average. I ran through the first sort of opening training level, as well as doing a couple of terrorist hunts as well, and I have to say that it was a pretty decent experience. The benchmark test came back with a similar average FPS too, but I prefer to show you real world gameplay in most instances. I think it's safe to say that the 750 Ti is still a decent budget card if you can get it for around sort of £50 to £70, dollars or euros. The 1030 is similarly priced in a lot of markets, but the 750 Ti will still be the better performer I've found in most instances. And it still supports pretty decent and modern features, like for example shadow play, which is essential if you want to record gameplay without the use of an external capture card. For example, shadow play, I use it all the time. There's barely any frame rate drop when you do use it as well. And it's ideal if you want to make videos. Years after launch, and this card still seems to be proving its own, even in some of the most demanding titles today. Assassin's Creed, however, going back to that title for a minute, it will have a little bit of trouble, but then Assassin's Creed is known to have trouble on a lot of GPUs. Even with my 1070, I do see some pretty horrific stutters, and the frame rate does drop to the 30s or 40s in some instances too, so it doesn't matter what you're using, the game just will absolutely have issues. So all that's left to say is hopefully join me in 2019 when we'll be taking another look at the 750 Ti, the 2GB version of course. Now they do a 4GB version, but I'd have to say if you're going to purchase one or thinking about buying one right now, then the 2GB one will do just fine. I don't think the 750 Ti has the power to make use of all that VRAM. I've never really looked into it properly, but the 2GB one is the one that's most common, the one that most people go for, and as you saw there, it will still do a fine job of running a lot of games even at full HD resolution. Price wise, you can find some great bargains on these now, and if you're stuck between one of these and say a 1030 for example, to be honest, either one is a good choice. The 1030 is newer, but the 750 Ti will offer slightly more power, at least from my experience. So, as always, if you like this video, leave a like on it, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.